Hello and welcome. Could a failing economy be a greater threat than terrorism? It's a concern already being voiced in the United States, with other countries now considering that risk. As the global economy continues to fall, there's a noticeable growth in social unrest. This week, more than 100 senior representatives of governments, workers and employers' organizations gathered to discuss the impact of the economic crisis on the more than 20 million people employed in the financial sector worldwide. Beyond the worry of crashing economies, a disturbing consequence of the downward financial trend is increasing volatility on the streets of some countries, with Greece, for example, witnessing riots. There's also been xenophobic union action in the United Kingdom and social unrest in China. Well, after months of strikes, violence escalated in the small Caribbean French territory of Guadeloupe last week after protesters complained of how low wages and high cost of living is affecting them. It resulted in the death of one union member, and the situation calmed down after the French President Nicolas Sarkozy announced a €580 million or $730 million financial relief package. Violent crime, xenophobia and other social ills are recognized as part of the classic reaction to unemployment. How effectively can these be tackled? On today's program, we ask, what are the social costs to the global economic crisis? Remember, you can join us in the conversation with your questions and comments. Log on to livestation.com/AJE, enter the chat room and take part. And we also welcome your phone calls on the show. Joining me now to examine some of the findings of the report and what can be done to prevent some of the predicted outcomes, I'm joined by Juan Somavia, the Director General of the International Labour Organization. At an ILO meeting earlier this month, he said European and Central Asian countries were heading into a dangerous downward spiral, and the downturn could put some 50 million people out of work across the globe this year. He also called for an economic stimulus package to address people's concerns about jobs and welfare, not just banking issues. Mr. Somavia joins us from Geneva. And from New York, I'm joined by Jeffrey Sachs, Professor of Economics and Director of the Earth Institute at Columbia University. Dr. Sachs has called for greater macroeconomic policy coordination to restore economic growth following the current crisis. He's also the author of Commonwealth, Economics for a Crowded Planet. Gentlemen, I welcome you to the show.
Thank you.
Mr. Somavia, first, if I could start with you, please, sir, and ask you about the ILO report that unemployment could hit 50 million this year globally. Why do you think that this could lead to such a high risk of social unrest if growing unemployment is not fully addressed?
I think that people have a feeling that they have no responsibility in this crisis, that they don't really understand how all of this mess could have developed. They see billions for banks and pennies for people, and they would like to see policies that address their problems of employment, of social protection. So it's a question of perception, of feeling that they're not being listened to, and that maybe their main concerns, which are family concerns and community concerns, are not being dealt with. And I think that that's the origin of tensions.
Of course, there's a lot of meetings being held to discuss the financial crisis across the world. And Mr. Somavia, if I could ask you what real results you expect from the gathering of those 100 top representatives of the employers and government and workers, what kind of real results do you expect they could come up with?
Look, we're in the middle of the crisis, and we believe that dialogue and discussing together the nature of the problem and how you can address solutions, having the employers, having the workers, and having governments, is a good way to go about it. But globally speaking, you need much more coordination between the different stimulus packages. And beyond that, you have the problem that many countries simply do not have the means for these enormous stimulus packages, mainly developing countries, where, you know, together with the 50 million that we mentioned, you can already see that the reduction, the increase in working poverty is going to be great. We place it at around 200 million, which means a backsliding in all of the advances in poverty reduction, and at the same time a weakening of the middle classes. So we have to be able to look at this in an integrated manner.
Okay. Dr. Jeffrey Sachs, great to have you back on the show.
Thank you. Pleasure to be with you.
Good, sir.
Even under very trying times.
I was going to say, times have changed since we last spoke. And in fact, U.S. President Barack Obama will be discussing his $850 billion stimulus package with Congress. And I wonder, you know, if that contains the kind of social welfare element, the strong social welfare element that would perhaps minimize some of the risks we're discussing here.
Well, there is, of course, a package of social support for unemployment compensation, for expanded health coverage for the poor, for aid to the states and cities in the United States which are in trouble, and wisely investments in long-term growth, especially in sustainable energy. What there isn't yet in the U.S. plan or in anybody else's plan is what Juan Somavia just mentioned, support for the poor countries. They're being battered by this crisis. They're losing export earnings. They're losing remittances. Expatriate workers are being sent home. Export prices are plummeting. Export volumes are falling. Investment that was supposed to flow into the developing countries has stopped. Capital is pulling out. It's a long litany of trouble that is being visited upon the poor world. And very little has been done so far to address that. This is a crisis that started in the rich countries, that has spread all over the world, that is impacting the very poor very hard. And we need coherent measures to support those people as well.
Well, Dr. Sachs, just a week ago, the U.S. National Intelligence Director, Dennis Blair, said the economic crisis is a greater threat to national security than terrorism. I mean, could things really be that bad?
Well, it is a tremendous threat because of instability that was already part of our world. Indeed, terrorism, in my view, is mainly a symptom of deeper causes, often extreme poverty, displaced populations, people that don't have water and food. And so we already lived in a world that was buffeted by poverty, by climate shocks, by, unfortunately, the indifference of the rich world very often. Now we have this massive global financial crisis on top of it. Of course, it's going to raise very, very serious challenges of stability because people will not be able to meet their basic needs. And we have a meeting of the major economies in London on April 2nd, the so-called G20 meeting. It's incumbent upon that meeting to do more than talk about banking regulation, as important as that is. It's crucial for them to face up to the question of how poor and vulnerable populations are going to be protected in this, and there are some very specific things to do.
Well, actually, Juan Somavia, one of the other factors that's being raised by that threat that was mentioned by the National Intelligence Director is that governments that essentially have been allies could find themselves becoming adversaries, and that you know, that suddenly these countries are in competition. Do you think all these factors are being fully considered when trying to build some kind of strategic plan?
I think that not enough, and that there's not enough conscious that there was a crisis before the crisis, something that Jeff was saying. And I think that the policy instruments that we had up to now don't work for the future. We overvalued markets. We undervalued regulation. We devalued the dignity of work or the protection of the environment. And consequently, we had a globalization model that was not fair and that was producing unequal results. Now, if we pretend to solve the problem by applying those same policies to what's going on and to prepare the future, this is not going to happen. And I think that it's by putting the right policies together that solve the problem today but think about a sustainable development in the future, we are going to deal with the security risks and the disquiet of people. But if people don't feel that what they're worried about, which is perfectly legitimate and reasonable, and that is that the decisions are being taken considering them, their jobs, and their families, of course, this is going to increase and the tensions are going to increase. There has to be a sensitivity for those that feel that they had no making in this crisis, and yet they are the most affected and the most vulnerable more so.
Dr. Sachs, you made a name for yourself somewhat, you know, helping the stumbling economies of places such as Latin America and Eastern Europe, and I wonder what parallels there are now at a global level with what you're seeing, and how much of the advice that you were able to give then could be applied now.
Well, I think that there were three parts of those crises that are relevant right now. One is that you need a medium-term plan. You can't just announce measures month to month, even week to week. One needs a framework, and that we don't yet have actually at the global level. Hopefully, President Obama is laying out a framework for the U.S. In his presentation today, and also in the budget later this week. But we need that. That's number one. Second, you need social protection in any program like this. And in the United States, our social safety net was already in tatters. There's some attention to it now, but let's face it, we were in in a crisis beforehand with a big underclass in this country. And the third is you need international cooperation. Every program that I was involved in that had success came often with a big fight to get help from the international community to make it possible to work or to cancel debts that were unpayable owed by poor countries. When there wasn't the international cooperation, the programs absolutely failed. If you turn that to our current situation, we need a global framework. Nothing has been laid out so far. We need to make sure that there is social protection. That's in tatters in many places. And third, we need a global framework not only for stimulus and recovery, but again, focusing on those places in the world that Juan and I are emphasizing. It's half the globe that can't do this on their own. But they're feeling the shocks of, just like the rest of us. Indeed, they're inheriting two shocks from the rich world. They're inheriting the financial crisis, and they're inheriting the climate crisis because of the famine and the droughts and the floods that they're facing. So the rich world's got to step forward. They can't say, oh, that's not our problem. They must come forward to be cooperative this time.
I wonder, Mr. Somavia, how much the period of relative success and growth that was taking place over the past decade or so and caused a neglect for the need to plan, the need to regulate, the need to actually think about caution in case of a collapse that seems to have happened now.
Definitely. You know, there were a lot of voices that said, be careful in the direction that you're going. You need to care much more about putting jobs at the center of things, social protection at the center of things, social dialogue at the center of things. In the International Labour Organization, we call it the decent work agenda. And most people aspire to have a chance at a decent job. Now is the moment to take those decisions. Regulation and deregulation is a tool. Sometimes you regulate, sometimes you deregulate. You regulate in one country, you deregulate in another. In one sector, you do this thing, and in another, you do different things. The moment you say deregulation is always the best solution, you transform a tool into an ideology. And it's this ideology that has led to the crisis we're in. We have to change that.
Well, gentlemen, I'm going to ask you to stand by. We have to take a short break now. More of our discussion in a moment. As we pause, let me remind you that you can join the conversation with your questions and comments by logging on to livestation.com and entering the chat room. You can see this debate taking place there right now. And also, we're taking a poll in the chat room. We're asking, should government stimulus packages focus on social welfare? Let us know what you think. We'll give you results when we come back.